Well, welcome back everybody. As you can tell from the title, we're working on the Mark II again. And if you didn't watch the end of the last video that I posted on the Mark IV, I gave a bit of a life update at the end of that. And to cut it quick and be short with it, I got a new job, and Kayla and I are going to be moving to a new house. So with all of that going on, that means that I need both of these cars, the Mark II and the Mark IV way over there, to be able to roll onto a trailer. Right now, with how they sit, technically the Mark II would roll onto a trailer, but as soon as I started driving, the hood would blow off of it, because obviously that engine support bar's kind of in the way. So we're going to put the diff into this transmission for the final time. Basically, we're going to do it properly. I guess I should show you guys. We're going to put the diff into this transmission, do all the preload. If you watched the previous video, obviously, we put the races and the shim in that side, just a race in that side. So we're going to do the last steps of that and make sure that the preload is proper. I'll show you guys how to check it. And then as long as that doesn't take too long, we're going to move on to the next step, which is putting this shaft, the output shaft, back into the transmission. So those are the old bearings still on it, so I have to pull those. I have new bearings to get them in. And then these are some tools that I've made to get this done. So hopefully we make it through all that. If we don't hit any snags with doing the differential, we'll be good, and we'll do the output shaft as well and get started on that. We're not going to do it all of the way, because just like we measured the preload on the differential, you have to do the same thing on the output shaft and shim it and all that fun stuff. So I have the base shim to put into it, but I do not obviously have the other shims to completely do the job. So we're going to see as far as we can get. Like I said, we're at minimum doing the diff, and then that'll be it. I'm not going to show you guys how I'm putting this back into the car, because it is not going to be the proper way. It's going to be, just thrown in there as quickly as possible, and then pack as much stuff into the inside of that car as I can, just to make traveling easier and take less trips. But I'm definitely going to do a video of, the end of this garage and the beginnings of the new garage that I'm going to be moving into, because they're very different. Yeah, that's all I'll leave it as. But I need to quit talking and actually work and put the camera down. So with that, let's get moving on putting this differential in it for one final time. I've got to get the bearing race out of the transmission case so I can put the proper size shim underneath the race to preload the diff. The shop press makes quick work of that, and you can see just how tightly I made the press tools, because I kind of got it stuck in the bearing bore just by trying to put it into the case to press this race out. So now with the shim out, sitting on top of that bearing press tool, we are going to go and put the, did I just say the shim? After getting the race out, we're going to go put the shim behind it. So this is the shim that I'm going with. This is the 0.65 millimeter thick shim. I know in the last video I said that I was kind of in between sizes. So I'm going to go with the looser fit instead of the tighter fit. If the later measurements that we're going to take fails, I do have the next shim size up just in case. And the other thing that we're going to do, same thing that I did on the other race, but if you didn't watch the other video, I'm going to put some Loctite 620 retaining compound on the outside of this bearing race. That way it holds into the transmission case a little bit better, because if you notice from me taking it out of the press, it came out really easy. And it pressed in really easy the last time, and that kind of makes me nervous a little bit. I don't know why the bearing races on the trans case expand it. It might have been from the heat of the powder coat. It might have been because these bearing races were in the transmission so long that, they just they took some of the aluminum with it when I removed them from corrosion and other things. Like, this is a 30-year-old, 30-plus-year-old case that we're working on. So it's not perfect anymore, and we're trying to do some things to get by. So yeah, that's what we're going to do now. And then it's back into the press to put the race in, and then the final step is doing some measurements. So let's do it. After pressing the race back in with the shim beneath it, I can reinstall the diff into the trans case and torque up the 5 bolts again, just like what I did when I was measuring the preload in the last video. Now, instead of taking preload measurements though, we are going to measure the turning torque that it takes to spin the diff with a beam style torque wrench. So now with the transmission, or the diff I should say, put back into the transmission case, we are ready to move on to the next step, which is measuring whether or not we preloaded these bearings properly. So to do that, we're going to be using these tools. So this is a beam torque wrench. You can see the scale there goes from 0 to 80 inch-pounds. The spec for the diff is you need to be somewhere between 11 and 31 inch-pounds on the torque it takes to turn this. So what I did to make a tool to do this is I just machined some flat bar to fit into the differential cup, and put the 1/4 inch square drive to match this guy in the top of it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put this on top of here like so, and then put the torque wrench in there, twist it, see what it does. If we did everything properly, it should fall between that spec of 11 to 31 inch-pounds. If we did something wrong, it might be too low, and that means that we didn't put enough preload on them, or it could be too high, and that means that we put too thick of a shim in, and we need to take that shim out and get a thinner one, which hopefully that isn't the case, because I don't have thinner ones right now, but we're gonna see. The other thing to note is that for this test, it's the Bentley manual and Broke VW's website states that the bearing should be oiled. I don't really want to put transmission fluid in it right now because that's just going to be kind of gross to deal with later. So I'm just going to spray some WD-40 in both sides, lubricate them a little bit that way. I mean, it's oil, not necessarily heavy oil by any means, but it really didn't specify what oil you should use. So I don't know if that's right or wrong, but it sounds good to me. So let's get moving. Let's see if I did this properly. Fingers crossed I did, because I don't want to redo this and I don't want to go order more parts. I need to put this back in the car. Yeah, let's go. The differential cups are really meant to press onto the output shafts of the differential itself, but I don't want to do that because I still need to take them back off after measuring this. So I just tap it on with a hammer and then make sure that the bolts are tight to reduce any slop in how that bar fits up to the differential cup. And now it's time to put a torque wrench on it and see what it takes for it to turn. As you can see, it's not looking good in this shot. I had to have Caitlin come out and hold the case while I tried to use a ratchet to spin it to see if the differential would spin in the case at all. So unfortunately that didn't work. So the problem is that when I go to spin the diff, even though it's a limited slip differential, I thought it wasn't going to do this. But basically when I go to try and turn the diff, this shaft spins this direction, should be what, clockwise. The opposite shaft on the bottom, which you can't see, it's in this tube, that is spinning counterclockwise. So just like an open diff, basically, you know, if you apply a load to one side, it spins the opposite on the other side. So I need to figure out a way that I can spin both sides of the diff in the same direction at the same time, which I was afraid was going to be a problem. I was just hoping that a limited slip differential wouldn't act in that manner. So with that, I'm gonna have to just trust my measurements for now and hope that the bearing preloads are correct. I mean, the saving grace is I'm only pushing it a little bit, like I'm pushing it out of the driveway onto a trailer and then off of the trailer into the new garage. So hopefully my measurements aren't so off that I like roach these bearings in that short of a movement. But even if I do, even though it would suck, I could buy another set of bearings and pull them off and redo all this. You know, it would probably take me a couple hours, but it's really not the end of the world. So yeah, that kind of sucks to hit that snag, but I don't have time to figure it out and fix it before moving this. So with that, I'm going to move on to doing the output shaft and preloading, or at least measuring those bearings to see if I can get some of that done ahead of time, or at least have the output shaft in the transmission. So what we have to do is we need to pull or press the bearing race out of the clamping plate. We need to split both of those bearings off of that shaft, and then I have fresh bearings to go on, plus the base shim to go in. And I have another chart of all those numbers as well, and the thicknesses that they correspond to, so I'll put those into the video later when we get to the point of me measuring those. It's going to be very similar to what we did for the diff in the previous episode, but for now, I'm going to get this race pressed out of this plate and press a race and the shim into the case, so that's done, and then we'll worry about splitting bearings off of the shaft and pressing bearings on and all that fun stuff. So let's get moving. I made another press tool to press the race out of this clamping plate, and as always, the shop press made quick work of popping this out, and then the same press tool is used to drive the new bearing race back in, just flipped around in the opposite direction. I tried to make all these press tools so that they're dual purpose and can remove and also install the same bearing. The critical thing with this race is to check that there is no gap that you can see between the race and the actual clamping plate, so that you know it's flat in there and pressed all the way down. Then it's time to move on to the case side of things for the output shaft bearings. First thing you have to do is put the base shim beneath the bearing race. Here is the part number for that shim in case you need it. And then put the race in the case using, you guessed it, the shop press and more press tools. I stacked a couple things on top of the press tool to avoid having to move the table of the press up towards the ram, because frankly at this point I was just feeling lazy. Alright, now that we got the bearing races installed, got that race in the clamping plate all flat, we have that race in the shim in the case side. Now we need to move on to taking the bearings off of the output shaft so that we can put new bearings on the output shaft. So to do that, I'm using my Kuko, I don't know how you pronounce that, 17-1 bearing splitter. This is the OEM tool that Volkswagen tells you should use. They are not cheap. Much like the bearing pullers that I have from the same brand, they are not cheap, but they do a damn good job of doing everything properly. And also, the nice part is that if you break anything, they sell parts. So that's the convenience of it, is if you damage something, you can get a replacement. But what we're going to do is we're going to take this bearing off first. So I'm going to put this around there and then throw it in the press. And hopefully it comes off kind of cleanly. I'm also going to try not to drop the output shaft. I don't know how well that's going to go, but I'm going to try my hardest not to ding this anywhere as I'm doing this. But yeah, we're going to do that bearing first, then we'll flip it over, do the bearing underneath, and then we can talk about what it takes to put bearings back on this output shaft, and then we can do measurements. So this is going smoothly so far. I should knock on wood. Can't believe I just said that, but hopefully it keeps up. This was my first time using this bearing splitter, so I had a bit of a learning curve with it. The bearings are pressed right up against the machine side of the gear, so there's not really a gap for the bearing splitter to slide underneath the edge of the bearing. In order to get around that and make sure that the bearing actually pulled off the shaft, I really just cranked on the bolts to make sure that they were super tight and there was a lot of pressure against the sides of the bearing races. One of the difficult parts of pulling these bearings off is making sure that you press straight down on the output shaft and don't have it cocked at an angle, as that's just going to spell disaster for removing these. It's difficult to be completely straight with how long that output shaft is. You can see that during this press operation, the pressure gauge really never goes up, but the bearing does significantly deform while being pressed until the output shaft literally shoots out of the bearing and falls. Now it's time to rinse and repeat though, and do this for the opposite side. On this side, I'm just using a socket that fits in the inner diameter of the bearing to press on the output shaft itself. I had more issues with this bearing wanting to deform and not actually come off of the output shaft, so I had to tighten the bearing splitter on even more, and then it finally released. So I think that might have been my first time ever pulling taper roller bearings off of a shaft by not a race, by the bearing cage, and it's kind of sketchy. I didn't really enjoy it. You might have been able to see that I was wearing safety glasses just in case the rollers came shooting at me. I really don't want to have that happen. But thankfully, everything came out clean. The second press was a little bit sketchier than the first. The first one came out clean. You can see it sitting here. They're dirty and disgusting. But you could maybe reuse that. It hasn't been hammered. This guy, on the other hand, the cage for that bent in all sorts of ways. The rollers are half falling out over here. So yeah, that one made me nervous, because what I really didn't want to happen is I really didn't want that cage to explode and all the rollers come out and have to deal with trying to get the inner race off of the output shaft somehow, because I just didn't think that was going to go well. Granted, I still dropped the shaft on the floor, like you can see in that last clip, which sucks. But thankfully, no damage. There's a couple little tiny flat spots that may have been there ahead of time, because this transmission was hammered. I mean, you can see the races where these bearings sat are not in the best of shape. They're not pitted or anything, and they're not heavily scored, but I don't think whoever has owned this car over the years did regular transmission fluid flushes and replacement. I think they burned the crap out of whatever fluid was in this transmission, And there's some other evidence of that too that I can get into later. But for now, we are one step closer to putting that output shaft actually in the transmission. So what we need to do now is the same thing that we did with the diff bearings. We need to use our dollar store pizza pan and put both those bearings, the new ones, obviously not the used and abused ones, the new ones need to go on the sheet pan into the oven for, I usually put them in for 10 to 15 minutes to get them up to 212 degrees. So first I gotta go check and make sure that my wife is not making lunch in the oven, because that would be a problem, or that she doesn't need the oven for the next half hour. But yeah, we're gonna put those in the oven, get them nice and hot, and then we will press one on. I'll probably press this guy, which is, it goes here. It's the equivalent. It's upside down right now, but you kind of get the point. Press this one, that way I can use the butt of this shaft to press against, and then I'll have to flip it around, stand it up nice and tall like it is, and then press, I don't even know where, no, that guy. Press that guy onto the bottom of that, like such. And I have tools to do that as well. So, enough chit chat, let's get moving. I made even more press tools to drive these bearings onto the output shaft. The main thing that I wanted to pay attention to was making sure that I put these bearings on in the right orientation, because unfortunately you can press tapered bearings on backwards and then you're truly up shit creek at that point and have to go buy another set of bearings. Thankfully though, I didn't do that, and the output shaft is ready to go back into the case for some preload measurements. So now with the bearings pressed, we are finally on to the last step. I guess the last two steps, because we have to put the shaft into the transmission case, and then we have to do the measurements, and then take it back out of the transmission case, obviously. But the bearings are on the shaft. They pressed pretty cleanly, thank God. So now what we have to do is, this shaft needs to go in that, and then this clamping plate gets put over top like so. At least I think that's the way that it goes. I'm going to double check before I actually go through and do the measurements, but I think that's the way that it goes. And then those bolts go in, and I think the torque spec is 30 foot-pounds, but I'll put it in the video. And then yeah, we set our dial indicator up again, just like what we did with the differential, and pull it up and down and see how much it moves, and then there's another formula for what shim needs to go in. I'll walk you through the math on that, but I am not going to be able to have time to take the shim out, the shim that's already in there. I'm not going to have time to take that out and put another shim in and then do the torque measurement like what we were supposed to do with the differential. I just flat out, I'm going to run out of time before moving to get that done. So that will be on a future video. I can't tell you guys when at this point, honestly. A while from now. Think like a month and a half or 2 months from now. We'll probably get the video on that. But the other thing that I realized while I was setting this up to take this shot, I think I realized why we couldn't spin the diff in the earlier clips, because the differential is hitting the transmission. I just happened to look, and you see that shiny spot in there, right about there? Yeah, that wasn't there before, because obviously this got sandblasted and is this nice rough finish. So something rubbed that. And what I came to realize when I looked at the diff is I have this shiny line on the housing, which thankfully, like, it rubs off. It's not permanent by any means, but that shows me that was rubbing on the housing. And the only reason that I found that was because when I took that transmission case apart with the diff in it, I basically said, screw it, and I'm going to spin these bearings just to make sure that, you know, nothing stupid is happening. And sure enough, something stupid was happening. So this is the, sorry, it's not hot here today, but it's humid, very humid, and no airflow in my garage. But that's the beauty of putting aftermarket parts inside of OEM parts. You know, the transmission case is a casting itself, which castings are not known for having great tolerances or great dimensions by any means. They're not super consistent. So, you know, most OEMs like leave a lot of extra clearance to the inside of a transmission or any cast housing, really. They just leave a lot of clearance. The only thing that gets like machined in these are stuff that has to, like for bearing fitments, those get remachined after they're cast. But like this profile here, that's not machined. That's however the cast form is, all of this. However the cast form is, they leave it alone. Like that is as cast, don't touch it, and go on your merry way. So when Wavetrac makes a differential that sits closer to that housing than others, or like than the OEM diff, then there's a slight chance that contact happens. And I'm sure Wavetrac has tested this in a ton of different housings, and maybe I'm just the lucky one that mine was a little bit thicker or a little bit more round or whatever you want to call it than whatever they tried these in when they were testing all of this stuff. And I didn't see anything about people having issues with the diff housing contacting the transmission case when I was looking into like what diff to put into transmissions and all that. And truly, like, it's very minor contact. Like, you can see how small that dot is. So what I'm going to do after I do the measurements and all that fun stuff for the output shaft, I'm going to take as much stuff out. I'm going to leave the bearing races in, which kind of sucks. But I'm going to take one of my air sanders and just put a little dimple in there. And hopefully I don't blow through the case, because then, you know, obviously that's a problem. I just need like a really light indentation to have clearance. But yeah, I'm going to do that at the end of this, I guess, now, and then see if I can spin the diff when it's preloaded, because that would explain why I couldn't get it to spin at all. Like, I was very surprised that the torque that it took to get to like overcome the differential was so high, because I don't know if you could see it in the video, but like the beam torque wrench went up to like 70 inch-pounds before I was like, this isn't good and I should stop, before I just wrench on it. And then that's when I got my little breaker bar out to try that, so I didn't damage the torque wrench by any means. So yeah, maybe we're going to come full circle at the end of this, but I'm rambling now. So let's do some measurements and then we'll come back. I'll sand the diff housing area and try again on doing those measurements, and hopefully we find out that my bearing fitment is correct. I don't know now, but we're gonna try it all. So let's get working. Alright, so as you can see, that's the entire setup. So we measured the bearing play, came up around 0.15 to 0.18 was like the highest that I saw every time. So somewhere in that realm. So the formula for calculating what shim you need now is your base shim, which is that 0.65 millimeter shim, plus your measured play. So in this case, we'll just call it 0.15. That puts us up to 0.8. And then you add an extra 20, not 20, 0.20, 0.2. Why can't I speak right now? We're at 0.8. You add 0.2 as a preload, so 0.2 millimeters on top of everything else. So for this transmission, I need a shim that is a millimeter thick. So 0.65 plus your measured play, which in this case is 0.15, plus 0.2 gets you to 1 millimeter total. So I'll have to order that from Volkswagen, get that in. I'm also going to order a 1.05 shim just in case I need a thicker one after I do the torque measurement, just because I got measurements of 0.15 through 0.18 when I measured the play. So just to cover my bases, they're not terribly expensive. They're like 20 bucks a piece, which is kind of expensive, but it's a precision shim, so I get it. So yeah, I'll get the next size up just so I have it. And then we got to pull the race out of the case, put the new shim in, and do all the fun measurements. But now with that wrapped up, and as you can see, the transmission is blown back apart, I'm going to move all of this stuff off my workbench. This, get rid of this, move that further away. You know, anything that is more precision or has bearings in it, stuff that I don't want to destroy. I'm going to move all that stuff, and we're going to take the grinder to that little tiny spot, see if I can make some clearance there. And then with that, we're going to double check. We're going to see if our diff spins now. If it does, awesome. If it doesn't, gonna have some other problems. But if it does spin, that means that everything that I said prior to this is a lie, which I'm fine with. I'd rather it be easier, but we're gonna find out. So let me set the camera down, fire up the air compressor. I'm not gonna record me doing this because it's just gonna be stupid loud, and you don't need to see me try and grind that little tiny spot out of there. If you need to see a video of how to clear that material out, you shouldn't be this far into a transmission case. But yeah, let's get that going. And then it'll be bolting this transmission together. And if the torque measurement works out, it's going to stay together. I don't have to take it back apart. So, fingers crossed. It'd be awesome if this works the way that I think it should, but let's do it. So it took a couple renditions, or revisions, whatever. Took a few attempts to get the housing ground out properly, but put some dicum on it to basically check and make sure I had clearance, and with no preload on the diff, there's clearance. So now I'm going to put the diff in, tighten everything down. Hopefully, obviously I can't see it, so I don't know how much of a gap there is. There is a gap, but you know, when I torque all the bolts down and everything smushes, hopefully there's still clearance. If this doesn't rotate when I put it all back together, then I know, and I'm probably going to see a ding in that bluing. So thank God that I had layout fluid, because that would have sucked to take this apart and put it back together every time. So now let's put the diff in, and hopefully we can check it, but we'll find out. Let's do it. Well, we fixed one problem and found another. So when I put the torque wrench on this, actually I can just show you real quick. When I put the torque wrench on this, literally 0 pounds to rotate this. Nothing. Like, not at all. Doesn't move. Glides real nice though. Fantastic. So what I have come to realize is that because the diff was hitting the trans case when I took the preload measurements for the last video, my preload's wrong now. And this is evident because when I go and move the, well, this is evident because I can move the diff. Like, which you shouldn't be able to do if you've preloaded bearings properly. I don't know what I could have done to find this before now, because everything in the Bentley manual says don't spin these bearings because they'll settle. But I only found that the diff was making contact when I went to try and spin it. So it's kind of one of those cat and mouse games where I was screwed from the start and just didn't know it. So I don't have the time to fix this before leaving. So I'm thinking that it's just gonna stay the way that it is until I get to the new place. And then I need to pull that race back out with the shim underneath it, get rid of that, put it back in with no shim, and do the measurements all over again and order completely new shims. This sucks, but this is the beauty of working on cars. 3 steps forward and 10 steps backwards. So I guess I'm gonna order that shim while I order the shims for, well, actually I might as well just wait and order all the shims in one shot. So that's gonna put us on hold for a bit. So kind of sucks to end this episode on like a, I can't call it a low note because we did fix something. It's just in fixing something we found something else that's wrong because I didn't know that it was wrong in the first place. But yeah, that's gonna wrap this video up. I'm probably not gonna make a video of fixing all this stuff because it's the same steps that we went through. Like, everything went proper. Like, I did the techniques properly in all the videos that I've done so far, but there's no point in redoing the same steps for you guys for another 20-minute or 30-minute long video. Like, I might as well just do it off camera and I can show you guys, you know, how the torque readout is correct when you have everything correct to start out with. But yeah, it bites, and now I'm rambling. But yeah, that's gonna wrap this up. I'm gonna start putting the transmission back in the car and get the car to a point that, you know, it's back on its wheels and doesn't have all this crap underneath it. That's where I'm at. So yeah, if you made it this far, thanks for watching. Click the subscribe button if you want to see more. If you want to see more of, you know, how I can mess stuff up from the outset. Really, I didn't mess anything up. It's just I was unlucky with my parts. But and sometimes that's all that it is. It's just luck. But regardless, that's gonna wrap this up. Thanks for watching. Thanks for subscribing. And we'll see everybody next time for, hopefully, the diff being installed properly and also the output shaft at the same time. That'll be the next episode on this car. I'm rambling though, so goodbye.